In this video, I'm going to talk about my top 10 sourdough tips. They're in no particular order. So number one, I would keep a baking journal or production sheet. One of the most helpful tools while baking sourdough is to keep a baking journal or production sheet. This document tracks key details like hydration levels, proving times, and the time the dough was placed in the fridge. By keeping a record of your bakes, you can identify patterns, refine your technique, and replicate your successes. I use a pre-made production sheet that I print out before each bake. You can find a link to the one I use in the video description. This sheet helps me stay organized and consistent, ensuring that I can look back and see how long I fermented the dough at different temperatures, especially useful for when the seasons change and you look back at what you were doing last summer or last winter. So with my production sheets, I've got a few back up here. So I can go back and look, okay, in March, this is what I did. This was the temperature. So for example, you got the ingredients on here, but this is what I look back on. So I've got the time I added the starter, 2 p.m, and the temperature. And then the first stretch and folds, which I know will end at 4. And I do a dough temp check on every single one. Estimate that in 6 hours, which will be 8 p.m, 2 to 6, will be a 6-hour bulk ferment. And then I will put the time that I put it in the fridge. So now I can go back and remember that this took 6.5 hours at this temperature. I've also got the starter ratio, which was 1 to 6 to 6, because we needed 1200. And I had 600 flour, 600 water, 100 grams of starter, which is 166. I also did a temperature check, and I also put the start time. So I fed it at 4 a.m. and it was ready at 2 p.m. And that's when I started the mix. So I can go back and go, okay, this ratio at this temperature for the starter also takes this long. So this is good to go back on, and you can keep it. I keep them all stored, all saved, and I can go back. I have about 20 of them, so all stored. By maintaining a baking journal, you gain valuable insights into your sourdough process and become a more confident baker. Dough temperature control is key. Both dough temperature and fridge temperature are crucial for successful sourdough results. I aim to ferment my dough at a consistent temperature of 24 to 25 degrees, which is about 75 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature typically allows for a 6.5 hour fermentation from adding the starter to shaping the dough and placing it in the fridge for an overnight or cold ferment. To maintain this ideal temperature, I use a homemade prover during winter. You can find a tutorial on my channel about how to do this. In summer, I employ ice cubes to keep the dough cool. I'll create a video explaining how I do this when it gets warmer. It is getting warmer now in Australia. Our temperature can hit like 30 degrees, which is about 86 degrees Fahrenheit and beyond. So during summer, if I can, I will bake like much earlier in the mornings before the heat kicks in, where in winter I can bake any time of the day. For the cold ferment, I keep my fridge at around 4 degrees, which is about 39 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. However, if the dough becomes warmer than 27 degrees, in summer, I will lower the fridge temperature to 1 to 2 degrees to really cool down the dough faster. But in winter, I keep it at 4 degrees. Number 3 is to maintain a happy starter. Keep your sourdough starter healthy by feeding it pretty regularly and storing it properly. A consistent starter leads to consistent bread. I have 2 ways of maintaining my starters. One is that I feed it every day, which is a ratio of 1 to 10 to 10, which is 1 part starter to 10 parts flour and 10 parts water. So for example, 10 grams of starter and 100 grams of flour and water. Now this is too much flour and waste if you want to feed it every day, especially if you're not using it. So I will feed mine 5 grams starter, 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water, which is still 1 to 10 to 10 to 10 ratio. This allows my starter to take around 24 hours to peak. Right about the same time the next day I need to feed my starter again. In summer and winter, I will change these ratios depending on the weather. So just like the dough temperature in tip number 2, starter temperature is important too. In summer, I will use less starter when feeding, and in winter, I will use more when feeding, because in winter it takes longer to grow, and in summer it will grow much faster. I have a video on my channel that goes into sourdough maintenance in much more detail. The second way I maintain my starter, especially if I'm baking once per week, is to place only the sourdough jar in the fridge with just the scrapings from the previous feed. Then about 2, preferably 3 days before baking, I will pull out the fridge and feed it a 1:10:10 ratio, just like the daily feed. My feeds just before baking are usually 1:4:4 or 1:6:6. So number 4, use stretch and fold instead of overmixing. Instead of traditional kneading, use the stretch and fold technique to develop gluten and build strength in the dough. There are various methods for mixing sourdough, such as hand mixing or using a mixer. I prefer a spiral mixer, where both the spiral and the bowl rotate. Unlike some bakeries, I don't mix until full gluten development. Instead, I will rely on stretch and fold to finish off the gluten development. It's easy to overmix in a spiral mixer, so leaving the last 20 to 30% of the gluten development to stretch and folds and using your eyes to determine the completion ensures consistent results. I usually aim for 4 stretch and folds, but sometimes I'll stop at 3 based on the dough's feel. When the dough is overmixed, the gluten strands become overdeveloped and tight. This can make it difficult for yeast to produce carbon dioxide gas, which is necessary for the dough to rise. As a result, the dough may rise slowly or not at all. Don't get me wrong, you can push the mixer to full development if you know the correct timings and your flour's capability, but even slightly overmixing can cause you problems. Much easier to just finish the final mixing by hand, in my opinion, and I love doing the stretch and folds, so I like getting my hands in and just filling the dough. Number 5, perfect your proven time with an Eloquot jar. Understanding when your dough is perfectly proved is essential. Overproven or underproven can lead to dense or overly sour bread. When you're new to sourdough, knowing when your bulk fermentation is finished is likely the most challenging step to learn and is, in my opinion, the most important part of the sourdough baking. At 25 degrees Celsius, which is 77 degrees Fahrenheit, I aim for 40 to 50% rise during the bulk ferment. While you can mark the sides of the tubs, it can be difficult to judge the rise, especially if the tub's not straight or it's curved. I prefer to use an Eloquot jar for more accurate measurements. You can use any small jar you have in your kitchen or purchase one specifically for baking. I have a video on my channel featuring the one that I use and how to use it. If you have a small sourdough jar at home, which you use for starters, this is a good jar to use too. I've used that in the past. This is a good option. And to get the lines, fill the jar with 100 ml of water and mark the jar where the 100 ml of water is. Empty the jar and then fill it with 150 ml of water and mark the jar. Where that 100 mark is where your dough that you put in is going to go. The 150 ml mark will represent the 50% rise if you add the 100 grams of your dough to the jar. Number 6, test your flour's ideal water hydration. Knowing your flour's water hydration is one of the most important parts of the sourdough baking process. Too much water can result in a sticky dough that spreads and doesn't rise well in the oven. Alternatively, not adding enough water can cause a very dry and dense sourdough. Luckily, there's a simple test you can do, which I also have a video about on my channel. Take 100 grams of your flour and add 70 ml of water. That would be 70% hydration. Mix them together and let them rest for about an hour. Stretch the dough, and if the dough is sticky, try again with 65 ml of water, and that would be 65% hydration. And see how the dough feels after an hour. If the initial test isn't sticky with the 70 ml of water, try 75 ml of water, which would be 75% hydration, and assess the dough. Keep experimenting until you find the perfect balance of the water and flour for your specific flour. Mine is about 83% because it's a high protein flour. So I've done the test, and I do the test pretty much with every new batch of flour that I get, because depending on the season, the amount of water that flour can take can change. But my flour could take up to 83% hydration. Number 7, Autolyse the Dough. Autolyse is a technique in sourdough baking that I absolutely love. It's basically a pre-ferment where you mix the flour and water together and let them rest before adding the starter and the salt. This gives the gluten proteins time to relax and start forming a network, which makes the dough stronger and elastic. One of the best things about Autolyse is that it helps reduce the amount of kneading that you need to do. Whether you're mixing by hand or using a mixer, Autolyse can save you a lot of time and energy. It's especially helpful if you're using a stand mixer because it's easy to overwork the dough. I remember before I got my spiral mixer, I would sometimes use my stand mixer, and that would get very hot while I was mixing the sourdough. The Autolyse took a lot of the stress off the mixer and it made it a lot easier to mix. I highly recommend giving Autolyse a try. It's a simple technique that can make a big difference in the quality of your sourdough bread because you're not overworking the dough, and this leads to a much nicer crumb. Number 8, shape with care. Shaping your sourdough is a crucial step that can significantly impact the final appearance and texture of your loaf. If you don't want to spend all that time mixing and proving for the bread only to lose the air during shaping. When shaping, be gentle to avoid knocking out the air while creating a nice tight shape. I like to use a technique where I stretch the dough and create tension. I fold the bottom third up, fold the sides towards the center, and then I will fold the dough onto itself. This helps to create a beautiful and evenly risen loaf. After shaping, carefully place the dough in the banneton or proven basket. Remember, the goal is to maintain the air and tension that you've created during the shaping process. At the end, go over the top of the dough, thicken the sides to the middle. This will give a little bit more extra strength and tension while in the banneton. Number 9, create a sourdough proven chamber. As mentioned before, I prefer to keep my dough, ingredients and starter at 25 degrees, which is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. I achieve this using a homemade prover, which I've made with an oven and a heat mat connected to an inkbird or temperature controller. I have a video about this on my channel. In the past, I've used an old fridge as the prover. Fridges and ovens are excellent for maintaining consistent temperatures due to their insulation. The night before baking, I will add my ingredients, starter and water to the prover so that everything is at the same temperature when I'm ready to bake. If your tap water contains chlorine, leaving it out overnight can help dissipate the chlorine, which can affect the yeast. During bulk fermentation, I place my tubs in the prover to prevent temperature fluctuations, ensuring more consistent results. At 25 degrees, 77 degrees Fahrenheit, the dough typically takes about 6.5 hours to finish proving. 6 hours of that is bulk ferment, 30 is sitting on the bench ready to be shaped. My friend uses a cupboard with a heating mat, so anywhere you can keep the dough warm will help with your fermentation. Consistent temperatures will lead to consistent results. Number 10, and the final tip, is to rest before slicing. Allowing your sourdough bread to cool completely before slicing is essential for achieving the perfect texture as the bread cools down. The crumb sets and the moisture is evenly distributed throughout the loaf. Slicing too soon can lead to a gummy or uneven crumb. So be patient and let it cool down completely before enjoying your bread. Thanks for watching my video, and if you like what you saw, subscribe to see my future content. And if you have any questions, leave a comment